Hello and welcome to Climate State, a weekly to bi-weekly broadcast on changes that are happening within the climate. This is your host, Gerard Spring, coming to you from the north. So I want to get into some of the recent changes that we've been seeing with the climate system. It's interesting that although the mainstream media seems very, very preoccupied with Trump and the antics of the Trump regime, that the climate system is still under absolute meltdown. I want to start off by taking some recent news stories about the Slims River in Yukon. So the Slims River is located in the extreme southwest of the Yukon territory, and it's a glacial river. So it's a river which runs down from a glacier, and it used to empty into this lake called the Kluane Lake. This is actually really important to me because I've actually been to Kluane Lake. There's a town there called Destruction Bay, which I actually had the pleasure of visiting once upon a time. It's a very beautiful area. There's a very rough subarctic biome. It's lush in a way. There's a lot of pine trees, but the pine trees are short. They're somewhat stunted due to being at high latitude. It's very harsh in winter sometimes, but in the summer you can get quite mild temperatures there. The annual melt and refreeze cycle of the glacier and such and so forth. So there's an entire biome that's associated with this, and there's lots of fish, and there's a wealth of bird life going on up there, a lot of complex lake biomes going on in this glacial river. So after a quick pit stop in Kluane Lake, the glacial river water from the Slims River would continue northward in other river tributaries, ultimately ending up at the Yukon River up in the north of Yukon. And there it would make a left and continue on to the Bering Sea via Alaska. And recently, this river has been rerouted south and is now pouring into the Pacific Ocean. And what seems to have happened is the glacier has actually retreated from melt, essentially, and a new drainage channel has opened up for the water to flow down. And this is why geologists call this phenomenon river piracy, as the new drainage channel has stolen the water from the old drainage channel. So consequently, the lake is actually going to experience a draining, and this will have probably a profound effect on the biosystems in the biosphere going on up in the lake. And it's really a tragic thing to see these kinds of things happening up in the far north of Canada. And it's probably something that might be a bit difficult for people to understand unless you have visited the place and you have seen its natural beauty. This is a beautiful area up in the Yukon and has a lot of very precious glaciers, very precious mountain reserves, and we're seeing effects in what is essentially a pristine wilderness with very little human impact. Direct human impact is now being severely impacted by climate change. Moving on, I want to take a look at what's going on down in the Great Barrier Reef. There's been a lot of news stories coming out recently about the coral bleaching events going on down there. So in order to explain this a little bit and what's going on with the Great Barrier Reef, I want to talk a little bit about coral bleaching and what exactly that is. So coral is kind of like a rainforest. You can think of coral as if they're trees, and as trees above ground collect moss, the coral kind of similarly collects these algae which grow on it. So in a way, the coral is a rainforest-like biome that occurs in shallow seas in warm waters. And what is going on here is that the algae, very complex symbiotic algae are growing on the coral, and the algae themselves are in this symbiotic relationship with the coral. So what happens is the coral is providing protection for the algae, and the algae is releasing oxygen, performing photosynthesis for the coral. So you have this positive feedback cycle of oxygenated water, the water that's constantly being oxygenated and that receives a lot of sunlight. And of course, this is why coral reefs attract all these different types of species, fish, different types of crabs, crustaceans, you name it. All kinds of things are living in the coral reefs. So what bleaching events are is when ocean temperatures fluctuate, when the ocean temperature becomes too high or the ocean temperature becomes too low, this algae layer is very sensitive and it can suddenly die off. And what occurs then is this all the pigmentation of the algae, those are the colors that you see on the coral, and the actual backbone of the coral, the polyps themselves, take on this white color more because of the calcium carbonate in their shells. And consequently, when you have higher ocean temperatures and higher ocean acidity, these coral reefs really, really begin to suffer because the extra dissolved CO2 is eating away essentially at the structure of the reef, while the high temperatures are deoxygenating it because it's removing this algae. And the coral reefs can grow back, they can repopulate, but they have to be protected. And repopulation is not reversible in a lot of ways. The reef will not just grow back the same way it was before after a bleaching event, especially after multiple intense bleaching events. So there's the repopulation idea where you have the natural algae coming back over time, but there's also the idea of regime change happening in the reef, where you have a new set of algae that come in to repopulate the ones that had been bleached off by the fluctuations in temperature. So this can have really catastrophic effects for the coral reefs. Unfortunately, coral bleaching is something that we're going to see a lot more of in the future as ocean temperatures continue to rise from effects of abrupt climate change, and as carbon dioxide continues to saturate the oceans, and we continue to have higher and higher CO2 levels in the oceans, causing them to acidify, attacking the structures of the reefs. So we really need to do as much as we can to protect the reefs. I think it's also interesting to point out one counterexample of this with the case of the Red Sea. The Red Sea is always a very warm sea. It's very shallow, located between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And it has a lot of thriving coral reefs, but this ocean is always warm. And for some reason there, the reefs don't bleach, showing that the algae can adapt. There are warmer ocean temperature variants of coral reefs, but overall, these biomes are very, very sensitive. And a warming planet, especially a planet which is warming so abruptly, doesn't give species time to adjust to the changes that would otherwise occur over tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. The reefs can make adaptations that can allow them to adjust to climate changes as they can respond in time with the climate. And the problem we have now is the changes are so abrupt that the reefs don't have a time to respond. So the algae die, the corals flash out, and they die because of these precipitous changes in the environment, the ocean environment. So that's what's going on with the coral reefs. I also want to take a moment to look at the overall trends of warming. We have had a lot of strange weather events. We had a lot of severe weather coming in North America, early severe weather storms. Other things that are worth mentioning are the large floods that were occurring in Peru and Colombia. Apparently there was a lot of large floods going on there. Very strange rain events happening, which probably has something to do with this warming trend that we're seeing in the Pacific Ocean. And that's a kind of El Nino-like feature that's coming up and redistributing weather patterns and causing these rainstorms. Also want to look at what's going on in the United States. There's a lot of warming areas. The East has in general been very warm, while the West Coast has in general been much cooler and wetter than just last year. It's been a very drastic shift in the weather patterns from year to year. And we're also seeing these kinds of changes over here in Europe, where you had plus 20 degrees Celsius one week and now freezing or slightly below freezing temperatures going on within the Balkan Peninsula. I also want to point out some other news, which is interesting, and I think it's worthy to mention, is the Trump regime has actually come out in support for geoengineering. And I think that this is a really interesting change, that you actually have the government itself coming out and responding to this idea of geoengineering as a technological fix for climate change. And of course, geoengineering efforts have been on the go for a long time. There's been a lot of patents going with geoengineering for different types of sprays, which can nucleate ice at different temperatures and things like this. Laboratory tests, in-field tests of geoengineering. We don't have any idea what the extent of these programs are. So it's definitely very disconcerting to note that Trump is coming out and supporting geoengineering, and geoengineering is becoming a concept which is making headlines in mainstream news. There's seems every other week or every week or so there's an article on geoengineering, kind of saying, oh well, technological effects to geoengineering, or geoengineering is going to save the planet, or geoengineering is a way out of the climate change problem, which of course it's not. You can't really do anything at this point to just technologically tweak the climate. Climate systems don't really work that way, especially considering now it's like, okay, there's been all these changes, and then suddenly you apply this another completely unknown massive stress on the climate system that's called geoengineering, and expect that things will improve. This is just pure insanity, I think, on behalf of the scientific community to entertain ideas like this. So I think I'm going to be doing a lot more of these more news type broadcasts, everyone, because there's a lot of things that are going on in the climate system, and it's really important to paint the whole picture of an instant in time, so to speak. I think it's not really so wise to just focus on maybe one event or one thing so much. I'll still be doing shows like that when something really major comes up with the climate system, but I like this kind of news idea as it kind of keeps everyone informed. So if you think this is a good format for the show, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to have some feedback on it. And also, if you could please share the show as well and try and get the word out there about what's going on with the climate system, that would be really, really great. And if you're here for the first time, please comment, like, and subscribe. And whatever the case, I'd like to thank you all for listening.